Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss Advent 4, which this year falls on December 20th. One content notification for this episode: in our conversations for both the first reading and the Gospel, or fourth final reading, we do talk a bit about consent.
We'd like to throw out a big thank you to Rachel Meyer-Laughlin for our wonderful theme song. And since we're not using a blog anymore, please check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references that we make in this episode.
And welcome today to our special guest, Suzannah Porter. She is a fierce feminist field chick of faith who is queer and Lutheran and a super techie genius. Today we're reading about Mary's encounter with an angel in Luke, as well as the Magnificat in place of a psalm, which provides the "Yes, I did" answer to the mansplaining song, "Mary, did you know?" Mary is a powerful woman who takes on a lot, so what better to deep dive into than Buffy the Vampire Slayer? Suzannah, you know much more about Buffy than I do. Can you give a quick overview of her and the series?
I would like to be super clear that I do not consider myself a Buffy expert. I don't consider myself there are Buffy experts out there, and I do not want them to think that I am stepping on their toes. I am with you. Your toes are very important, Buffy experts. I am not in your league. From my weird perspective, as a Lutheran person and a queer person and a person who believes in women's rights, I just have a different take on it. So the way I would explain it, it's very campy. There's a lot of metaphor about the demons in our lives and the troubles in our lives, and those in the show are actual demons. And it's about a girl who is chosen, I'm putting air quotes right now, chosen. There's one in every age, one in every generation, and when one dies, another one is chosen and activated to fight the powers of evil, particularly vampires. And so this is about one of those vampire slayers in a long line of vampire slayers. And she is, in the beginning of the series, kind of like your high school blonde cheerleader type, and throughout the series she becomes this fierce warrior for herself and her friends and the world.
So, Suzannah, what are the connections that you notice between Buffy and Mary?
Two things off the top of my head, right? There's two readings that y'all sent me. The one was Luke 1:26, and then the other was Mary's Magnificat. Now, obviously, the Magnificat, there's a lot of incredible connections I see. There's a sense of Mary has a sense of her place in history, of her sense of her place in the world, and the important cog she is in the wheel, the importantness of her. And as much as the church in history has wanted to just say she's one of many and one of, the fifth one in the long line of Jesus's heritage that Matthew points out in the beginning, she is aware that she's a pivotal piece and that she's part of a very long history. She's got a generational point of view in her Magnificat. The other thing is that, and so it reminds me of that part in Matthew where they go through Jesus's genealogy and points out not the women we would think.
Yeah.
Right?
I think there's 4 women in there, and they are all unusual.
Very unusual. Most of the time scandalous.
Yeah.
Most of the time dealing with some kind of great odds. A lot of times those odds having to do with women and sexuality and being in a place where they were not being able to fit the societal norms about a woman with what righteous sexuality looks like to women. Jesus comes from a long line of scandalous women, and Mary's the latest one, and you can tell that she understands that she comes from this long line. And so this is a long line of unexpected women, and Buffy is very much in that vein. Like, you're expecting, a crossbow-toting, super empowered warrior type with crossbows and scars. And there are some Slayers that they bring up in the future parts of the series that fit that. But Buffy is unexpected because she still wants to go to prom. Like, and so she's...
Which is reasonable.
Which is reasonable.
It's fine.
It's reasonable. It's like, can I kill vampires and also have a significant other? Like,
yes.
There's that like recognizing that she's one of history and recognizing that she's yet another unexpected, but making that role her own. And then the other thing is that honestly, the Luke 126 that y'all sent me, 126:38, reads like a Whedon script. It reads like a
Oh, please don't ever encourage Joss Whedon to make his own version of the Bible. No, I refuse.
Like, you have this angel, like, I mean, like, I need you to imagine this like Whedon, okay? Like, I need you to imagine this as a scene in, like, a Whedon show, where, like, this, like, big, magnificent angel and glory and, like, intimidation, and it's, like, descends upon this person. It's like, greetings, favored one, and the person is perplexed. It's like, what kind of greeting is this? It's very, very, very Whedon-esque. And then later, Angel does his super formal, like, it feels also, relatable. This is how I feel in church all the time. So, like, it does a super, like, formal, he will be great, he will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give to him throne of his ancestor David, he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom there will be no end. And Mary's like, yeah, I'm a virgin. So, like, there's just a lot of,
do I, as a teenage girl, have to teach God about basic biology? Because that would be awkward.
Like, she's kind of, like, I read it like she's kind of sassy. Like, she really kind of does sound like a Buffy in a high school when the person is like, you are the chosen one. It's very much like that beginning episode. You are the chosen one. And she's, yeah, so...
About that.
No, I would be like, eh. And then the last one is like, and now Elizabeth, in her old age, has also conceived a son, and this is the 6th month for her who said would be barren, for nothing is impossible with God. And she's like, okay. Like, just, it's so very Whedon in it. It's like Whedon could have written it. Those are connections I see with Mary and Buffy, but I also think Buffy approaches her place in history in a very Marian way. As she starts off very similar with this kind of like sassy young attitude, but still like perfectly fine. Yeah, I'm here to call evil. I'm here to go find it and get rid of it. And yeah, okay, that's impossible, but sure, why not? But then also as Mary progresses, becoming more and more integral in Jesus' ministry, like, you also see Buffy also mature in that way towards the end and almost become a messianic figure herself. And you see them in a lot of the key parts of the series. There's the part in the series where she sacrifices herself for her sister because it is all about love and it is all about blood. A blood sacrifice is required. And she realizes it's so messianic. So she realizes, like, her sister's supposed to be doomed to, like, be the only thing that can close this portal. Her sister has to die. And Buffy is like, we have the same blood. It's my blood that I can sacrifice my own blood. I can be the sacrifice for someone else. And so there's this theme of sacrifice that also requires blood.
But Dawn is not Buffy's sister in the traditional way, is she? Like, they
no,
didn't grow up
she's
together.
not. She is actually, wait for it, Christians, she is a word made flesh. She is the key. She is an energy that has been made flesh. There's a whole lot of Christian iconography going on in there.
And I think several books have been written on the subject.
That's that. So there's the sacrifice. And then there's the resurrection, obviously, from death. And then there's the final episode, which I find to be... I loved it. I know there are a lot of people that are like, man, I loved it. I thought it was great. I like cried like a baby. So in the last episode, she is making the sacrifice to make sure she does this spell and she holds off the powers of evil and whatever. But like, it's basically what she does is she gives the power of being a slayer to all potential slayers. It's very Pentecostal. This spell is to take her call and her chosenness and all the other potential slayers of the world, because there's always like potentials waiting in the wings before the slayer dies, are activated immediately. I find it very spirit descending after a resurrection where all who are called are activated.
Yeah. That's really cool.
So there's a lot of messianic
I love that sense
from my
of
perspective.
kind of the chosen one, the way that Buffy is both the chosen one in terms of Mary being chosen in this passage, but then as we look, right, we think about Christmas as the beginning of our exploration of Jesus' ministry and Jesus' life and death and resurrection. And so then it's like looking at Buffy from Mary's perspective, and also Buffy as a Jesus-y character, a messianic character. There's such a strong connection in both of those senses, which I think we don't always get those connections, particularly with Mary, that like so many of our songs and stuff about Mary, right, are like, Mary, meek and mild. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that she's meek and mild. She gave birth to the Son of God, for crying out loud, right? So there's this like sense that tying Buffy in with Mary, especially, I think it gives a much richer sense and maybe even a much truer sense of who Mary is and the strength and power of Mary that doesn't come across through millennia of patriarchal church history.
Yes. What's the thing that you pastors are super into that you will not tell the rest of us laity about? Hermeneutics of suspicion.
Yes, hermeneutics of suspicion. Question everything.
I'm confused about the "we're not telling laity about it" part, but
okay. Oh yeah, like every pastor that has ever talked to me about it has said, "Oh yeah, because we were always told that the laity aren't ready for it. We are always told that the congregation aren't ready for it."
I learned about it.
It's
in college,
very sad
in my women and gender studies classes. So.
It's very meta. Mm-hmm. So like from what I understand, like our approach about hermeneutics of suspicion is very meta because it's basically an example of the thing that we're dealing with. So like the idea that like because of all the traditions and normalcies and societal norms and everything that's existing at the time, anything that bubbles up past that is more likely to be divinely inspired. Mm-hmm. That's from what I understand, right? Like so like in a lot of ways, like just being able to just talk about it itself in a church that doesn't want to talk about it is very meta. This Magnificat of Mary's is a perfect example of that to me. There's definitely an attempt, as we've all seen, to make Mary this meek and mild person, but somehow in the midst of all of that, this Magnificat that's voice of strength and voice of empowerment and voice of like almost on par with the angel. You talking to me? Okay, I'm talking back. Like there's not of like, oh, I'm lowly, I don't deserve to hear your word. There's none of that happening. It's like, I'm here, I'm ready, what's up? Like, and here's my response. That's the way that it has been recorded, despite all the societal norms that would have loved to cut this or rewrite this or whatever. That makes it even more divinely inspired, which is what reminds me of some of the themes in Buffy. That's a major theme in it a lot. Like that she will survive by unconventional methods. Like there's this whole society of watchers that are like, this is the way you do Slayer things. Slayers do things this way. And she's like, nope, gonna do it my way. And the fact that, and doing it her way wins. Do you see what I'm saying? Like it's more divinely inspired. She's almost more chosen because she's able to exist outside of that and survive outside of all of the pressure that says, no, you're supposed to do it this way.
And I think it's part of what I find myself saying frequently as a pastor, both to myself and to other people, right, is that our calling is not to be someone else. Our calling is to be our best selves. And that means living into what are our gifts and what are our skills and what are our passions, and living into our own way of doing something, which is, like you just said, what Buffy is doing, where she's saying, this is how I'm going to be a Slayer. Like, y'all picked me, I said fine, this is what it's going to look like then. And Mary does the same thing, where it's like, do you understand biology? Okay, that go around makes sense, let's do it, but this is the way it's going to happen. And I love that, those connection pieces of like, okay, but it's going to be my way. It's an autonomy over your own self, too.
Yes.
her way is God's way. It's not just that, like, it's God's way, so therefore it's her way. No, she says, this is my way, and my way is God's way. There's just a lot of autonomy and agency in there, and willingness to connect yourself with God's larger plan, God's larger vision, and like what a blessing it is to see yourself in this larger vision, because most of us don't get to see that. And she sees it and accepts it like on its face without getting freaked out by it, without questions of, oh my gosh, I'm at the tail end of this long heritage and this long generational thing. Will I live up to it? Will I not live up to it? I mean, like, girl has no imposter syndrome at all. Zip. And like, that's glorious. That is glorious. There are times when Buffy has imposter syndrome. It's like, maybe I'm not doing the Slayer thing right. And she like listens to the Watchers and she gets a little intimidated, especially when Faith comes along and Faith is like, wonderful Slayer. But you learn through the series that that's, like Pastor Emily was saying, not being yourself, not being your best self is part of the problem. And so when Buffy tries to be like Faith, everything goes wrong. And she's unable to do what she's called to do. And similarly are we, that when we do things exactly how the church says that we all have to do things, instead of being our best selves, then we answer God's call in our lives incorrectly in a way that harms us or harms other people. And I love that Mary has this sense of like, I'm going to answer this call in the way that I want to, because that's not just an empowerment. I think that's what a call looks like.
Yeah.
Car's starting to become a theology thing to me. God is in the side hustle. It's really starting to become a thing, like, because of what we're talking here, because that's where we show Marian authenticity. Our side hustles where we're not yoked by the church and its institutions and all of the things that the church says, you know, like the church is very clear, like, we think this is good, we give it money. We think this is extraneous, we don't give it money. Like, and there's a worth on those ministries or on those activities. And in our side hustles, we're unburdened of that judgment of worth. And so I think God's call is where we find Mary levels of authenticity.
While we're talking about Mary, seems to be a good time to talk about Joyce, because Mary is the mom of Jesus and Joyce is the mom of Buffy. So I was wondering, since a lot of Buffy fans do seem to have very clear thoughts on Joyce, Suzannah, do you have any particular thoughts about Joyce?
No. Like, I mean, the short answer is no. Joyce is lovely, and...
Do you have thoughts about fandom's thoughts about Joyce?
Okay, so here's what I think. Again, I'm not going to instigate the mob. They're not going to come my way.
That's reasonable.
But here's what I think about Joyce. There are a lot of queer aspects of Joyce, so I appreciate the plot line. And reason being is, like, yeah, there's a lot of commentary on her as a mother. Okay, I think it's very heteronormative to discuss her as a mother and discuss her, when let's say talking about family inside the Buffyverse, talking about Joyce. Like, when you talk about family inside the Buffyverse, you're talking about Xander and Willow and Dawn, and like, you're talking about all of the core people because they're family, because the queer thing about Buffy is this is chosen family. So the Scooby Gang is the chosen family, and it's super, super, super queer at Buffy to make family about that. So like, people have a lot of commentary about Joyce as a mother, but I don't really care, because like, I feel that the choices and the statements that are made in the Buffyverse about family are very queer in their nature, because they're about chosen family, and that a family is who you choose and will die for. But I guess what I think is that the real Marian, like, if you're looking for the Marian aspects of Buffy, it's not in Joyce. It's in Buffy herself, and the way that she mothers her friends. And we all get to be, like, Buffy is the essence of the things we all get to be. I mean, that's how the whole series ends, is by opening up the concept of chosenness to everyone. It's likewise for parenting. Buffy is the parent here. In some respects she's good, in some respects she's not so great, but that, like, they take care of each other in that way, they parent each other in that way. And I mean, like, there's a lot of like gay baiting in the Buffy talking about being the Slayer. She's like, so there's a thing. Well, have you ever tried not being a Slayer? There's some gay baiting in there, and that might be part of the thing. Well, you know, a lot of us were really pissed about Tara's death. Like, we're not here for the constant bury the lesbian trope that's always happening in sci-fi. Like, it's getting old. Let it go. You don't have to kill every lesbian that walks into a scene. I'm so over it. Which, by the way,
shout out to the Supernatural fandom.
True. Moving gaily forward, where do you want to go to next?
Technically, our first reading for this episode is from 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 1 through 11 and verse 16. King David talks to the prophet Nathan about building a proper temple where the Ark of the Covenant can be kept. But God tells Nathan that David is not to build God's house. Instead, God will build up the house of David and David's legacy.
So one of the themes that came up for me in this passage was changing minds. And I think it's hilarious because it's not just that David asks Nathan and then Nathan consults God and then says, this is the deal. It's that David says, this is what I want to do. Nathan says, go do it. God is with you. And then has a dream where God's like, no. And then Nathan has to go back and be like,
I forgot to talk to God about this, sorry.
Right? Like, I was supposed to check with somebody on this. I didn't have all the information. And it reminded me of Katniss. You will notice in this particular episode a strong theme of young adult dystopias. This is my reminder that if Advent were a literary genre, it would be young adult dystopias. That is my claim.
That is fair.
That is my fact. This passage, the changing minds part, reminded me of the point in Catching Fire, the second Hunger Games book, where Katniss is freaking out because she's really quite self-centered because she's a teenager. And so she's looking at all the ways that she's in trouble and the people she loves and cares about are in trouble. And so she's talking to Gale and she's like, what if we just take off? What if we leave right now and take off? And we could make it. We could escape the capital. Then she lets slip that there's conversations about uprisings and Gale's like, we can't leave when there's an uprising. And then she goes back home and then realizes that no, he's right. We can't just leave. You have to be in this to be in it. So it's for her, it's okay, getting past my fear and my motivation of fear into what is the actual role versus David being okay, I'm all settled. Let's settle God down. Put God in a box or a house and we'll be fine.
Because that always works out so well.
God lives great in boxes until, God actually is stuck in one and then you're like, what? What?
Well, okay, so I feel like Lady could benefit from pastors talking about that aspect in our obsession with our buildings. Because we're obsessed with our building. And we have lost the concept of that it's a church and not a museum.
Yeah. I was actually thinking, Suzannah, when you were talking about the box and the ways that we're so invested in buildings and so I've been in congregations where the building is a huge asset. Right now, the congregation I serve, Trinity Las Americas, aside from the pandemic, the programs that are housed in it and were birthed from the congregation are after-school programs, a feeding program, a massive ELL, English language learner program, all of those. And it takes up all of the space in the building. So the building is old and the building does need repairs and all of those things. And there are times when every single room in that building is packed, right? And so I have been in that situation. I have also been in the situation where the building is loved because people have put things into it and loved ones who have died have helped build things for it and not because it is useful or fulfills the purpose. The connection that actually went with one of the connections I was making to 2 Samuel was that point where in verse 1, we hear, now when the king, David, was settled in his house and God had given him rest from all his enemies around him. So it's this settling in that I think we do, where at some point we built a building or a building was built and there was this purpose and there was this energy and there was this push and movement around it. And then there's a point of settling. And it's important to settle sometimes, right? Like in the West Wing, right after Jed Bartlett is reelected, he and Dr. Bartlett just want to settle in for the night and like have a night to be settled. And then they keep getting bugged by the staffers and it's hilarious. But there is that point where like we do need to like settle in. But if we decide to settle in and then just stay in bed all day as a like congregation, that's not going to be fulfilling our purpose as a church. It's when we get too comfortable with where we are in the building and we're not pushing ourselves to make sure that the building is serving a purpose for the larger community, for the mission that we're trying to carry out as a congregation. That's the point where it's like, okay, we need to rethink why we actually care about this building and if that is actually in line with our values and with
I feel you. The congregation I serve is Abiding Savior in Columbia, Maryland. It's a little itty bitty building and it's fairly new. It was built in the 60s. And this is like the first building I've ever been in where the congregation's love of the building is legit because of the way it's being used by the community. Like, they have made this building the heart of their community. Members can use it for receptions and all kinds of things. Like, the rental rates are just a steal. Like, it's the cheapest place to do anything. And before the pandemic, I have a cell phone video. I'll show it to you sometime. It's the most beautiful thing. I don't have any faces on it. It's just me walking through the halls and you can see the floor and you hear the Boy Scouts drilling into the wood because they were making these racers, and then you go past the other room and you hear a kid playing their violin because that's where we're giving violin tutoring lessons, and then you go into the narthex and there's people waiting for lessons in the other room because the Hopkins is always like doing a whole bunch of lessons. Like, so it just like the building was filled that night with me staying too late at work and Boy Scouts and violins, and it's just beautiful. It was just beautiful. And then there's other congregations that I've been at that like it's really about maintaining. I don't know. It's
about maintenance and not mission.
Well, not even like just maintenance, but like I mean it's maintenance of a specific thing, of an image. You know, and that image is not just what's inside the building. It's also, because I think to what Pastor Emily was saying, when we settle, we also start applying that attitude about our building to our people. And then we expect our people to also become these mausoleums without change and without action in the world. So when you settle in that way for too long, we also expect our pastors to do that, and our admins and our church councils, and we don't expect them to take risks and continue moving about in the world. And I love that God here is saying what is godly, what is being part of my family, is constantly moving about in the world trying to make it better. And when we become, as a church, too obsessed with these things, like, you know, like making sure that the building is always perfect and like putting that above, like, okay, we don't want to serve homeless in our building because they might mess up the floor. We don't want to have harm reduction programs in our building because we don't know who the people are and they might not take care of the building. And like we start doing this, then we're missing out on what God is calling us to do in terms of, you know, loving our neighbor and providing for our neighbor and who is our family. And then we apply these to the pastors. So now it becomes like a festering infection.
It's the Pygmalion effect. Mm-hmm.
It's bad.
But like, this is what we're envisioning for you, and that is then what happens.
All of this reminds me of Battlestar Galactica, by the way, which is a whole nother thing, because they settled for this Earth because they were so tired of wandering, and then it ended up really being bad for them, and a lot of people died, and they had to get up and start wandering again. But like, the whole point being is that this also ends up being done to our staff and our ministries. And so our pastors are expected to have quote unquote office hours where they're not doing anything. They could be out in the community making connections and supporting other causes, but instead they're supposed to have office hours where they just kind of sit there, maybe in case somebody comes by, or admins as well. We have this like weird fascination for people just sitting there looking like it's all together. And it makes me really, really uncomfortable. Because it's not the action in the world. I am also an Enneagram 8, so I want to see the action in the world. I have never even thought about this passage being applied to our obsession with our buildings. But this is very Battlestar Galactica. I'm obsessed now with looking at this as Battlestar Galactica. They have to move. They constantly have to move, and when they stop moving, there's like a literal part in the very first season then where you might remember where if they stop moving, they die. They will die because the Cylons will find them. They have 30 minutes, so they can stop for 30 minutes before the Cylons are able to find the signal, and then when the Cylons find the signal, they show up and they start shooting. So they have to jump. They have to do warp speed jump every like 31 minutes, and everybody's on a timer, and by the end of it, everybody's exhausted and they just want to stop and they just want to stay. But like there's definitely a theme of like if you stop for too long, you die.
When we reach verse 7, we hear, "Did I ever speak a word with any of the tribal leaders of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar?" God's the one speaking now. And here we see God jumping in to stop David from throwing himself into a concept that I like to think of as being from ancient knitting lore, called the sweater curse, where if you decide to make a loved one a sweater, there is a very decent chance that you'll end up very angry at that person before you finish it. This is because people who don't knit often don't realize the amount of work and the dozens to hundreds of hours it takes to make something like that. They don't give it the proper weight, emotionally speaking. And so if the gift receiver isn't as into the idea as the knitter is, they won't take questions about style or fit seriously. They won't value the gift like they should. They probably won't understand the amount of money that went into the materials that made it. And they will probably infuriate the knitter in a number of different ways. So imagine if David had gone to the trouble of building God a whole temple, only to find out that God didn't want one. Like, thank goodness Nathan interrupted him in time, right? Consent is important, folks.
Thank goodness God interrupted Nathan to interrupt David in time.
God gave Nathan the dream, and Nathan took the dream seriously and managed to interrupt David before, like, more than just a couple of plans were drawn up. But the ultimate point of this is, even when it comes to gifts, consent is important, folks.
Yes. I don't know anything about that. I'm knitting slippers for my aunt, who I'm confident will not listen to this podcast before she gets
slippers are slightly less time-intensive.
Exactly. And it's leftover yarn, so it's not even like... I mean, it's leftover yarn from, like, the last time I knit her slippers, which was leftover from, I don't know, when I was a kid. Our psalm option for today is actually from Luke, so Pastor Kay and I have chosen to go with it because we usually avoid psalms because they're harder to, like, do the connecty pieces with, but this is the Magnificat. Ain't nobody skipping the Magnificat.
Yes.
So, our passage is Luke chapter 1, verses 46b through 55. 46a just says, "And Mary said..."
You can read 46a if you want. I'm not going to argue with that. That's fine.
You could, and the link that we have includes it because there's no way to include half verses on our...
If you try to attribute this to anybody but Mary, we will get angry with you. That's a whole separate conversation. Don't do that.
I mean, unless we're, like, attributing it further back to, like, Hannah.
Yes.
Anyway, in her song, the Magnificat, Mary praises God's mercy and strength, and especially God's habit of upending human power structures to lift up the weak and powerless. So one of the themes for this is bursting into song, which apparently happens in Buffy, as we just learned today, but I didn't know about that. But it also happens in, like, Grey's Anatomy, and I don't know, I feel like it happens at least once in, like, every TV show that lasts a certain amount of time. And those always feel fairly weird and artificial to me, where I'm like, this is awkward. I'm not sure how I feel about this. But okay, because it's one episode. Unless it's, like, a show that's always a musical. But I love, in particular, and the Magnificat, it even just says Mary said, right? It doesn't say Mary sang. But in my head, Mary always sings this. It's always a song from her. And so I love having, in, like, a worship service or something, the many different iterations of the Magnificat sung throughout worship. So you get, like, all of the hymns, like Canticle of the Turning, that are the Magnificat in different ways. But then as the psalm, right, you get someone singing the Magnificat, especially if you can get like a young teenager to sing it, it's like especially powerful. But also like when you're reading the gospel, if you choose to include it in the gospel, to have that like break into the reading of the gospel with the song, or like in the sermon where it breaks in with the song, those are like the things that make my heart so happy. Not that I've ever actually experienced it. I've just heard people talk about it, and it sounds amazing.
Yeah.
We should all burst into song about toppling capitalism.
Actually, I did want to bring up something that is related to something we said earlier. We especially love the Magnificat because it is so very much about Mary knowing what's going to happen to Jesus. And thus the song Mary Did You Know, which is a popular Christmas carol, is
super mansplaining popular Christmas
and
carol.
Actually the original author of it has been pretty mansplaining about it too. But the thing is, I heard a theory about how to sing it yesterday, literally, that I think is really interesting and really puts a different spin on the song. What if, instead of singing it as a Christmas carol, what if it was sung by one of the women at the foot of the cross to Mary, who is wordless with grief?
I actually have heard that before.
It is a very different spin on the song, and I think I would be a lot more patient with it. Because if it's one of the women at the cross with Mary asking those questions, that's
like with her.
That's reasonable. That's not mansplaining. That's trying to reach out to her in grief. I can see that, you know?
Yeah. Definitely better than mansplaining McMansplainer. Yeah.
So in verse 46, we hear Mary say, "My soul magnifies the Lord," which oddly enough is where the name of this thing comes from. And I love this image. I love doing children's sermons about this image. Imagine the center of who you are making God easier for others to see. You know, that's what this phrase is about. My soul magnifies the Lord. Who I am makes God easier for others to find.
I've never thought about it that way.
And all you need for the children's sermon is a magnifying glass. And it's wonderful. It reminds me about how in Star Wars, Jedi often talk about how with some of their number, it is easy to see the Force flowing through them and at work in them. Some Jedi just like have such a connection with the Force that you can like see the Force as they're working in it. It's really sort of spiritual and magical and that kind of thing. Whereas other Jedi have a much more, workman-like kind of relationship with the Force, and like sure they use it, but it's less of a obvious connection. You can't really see it in the same way.
Well, and when you were saying that, it reminded me of what Suzannah was saying earlier about Buffy's, okay, fine, I'm going to be a Slayer, but I'm going to do it my way. And that way actually becomes a magnifying, an easier way for people to see and encounter.
And for that matter, magnifies the Slayer number, among other things. Yeah.
And this is what I love about Buffy, is that she's like the show is about the physical manifestation of metaphorical things that we talk about. So we talk about the demons in our life. So the show has actual demons. I mean, in this case, we're talking this metaphorical of magnifying the Lord, magnifying God's presence in your life. And she's magnifies the amulet in order to take the magic of being chosen, and it is like a magnifying glass that just like it goes all out into the world, and it shines out. It burns Spike alive, unfortunately, but like it burns. Sorry, spoiler alert. He comes back during Angel. Everything's fine. Moving right along, and magnifies out into the whole world, activating all of the potentials.
I feel like we should include a warning here that if your soul is magnifying the Lord in such a way that other people wind up getting burned alive, you're doing it wrong, okay?
Yeah, but that's the moment, no, because that's the moment where Spike becomes messianic.
Okay, but in general, I'm just trying to say, like, if...
Messianic figures have to consent.
Yeah, if you're magnifying the Lord in such a way that it leads you to, like, trying to burn witches, no, that's not what we're about. That's not
so much magnifying. But if other people could catch the fire...
All messianic figures consent. Now we're in the deep theological concept of how important consent is to being messianic.
I love that none of us actually want the physical, like, setting people on fire thing. That's not what
well,
we're
none
arguing
of the three
about.
of us, no.
But I
there
love
are
that
people
that's
out
where,
there.
like,
I'm just
Kay
saying.
keeps going while
Like,
Suzannah and
I feel
like,
part of my job on this
and
podcast is to keep saying, no, murder is wrong. Okay? That is, like, part of my job description here.
Details. Anyway, as we continue with the Magnificat into verse 51, we hear that God has shown strength with their arm. They have scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. And I was thinking about Firefly, the show Firefly, which was woefully short.
And another Joss Whedon creation.
Yes. And the thing in Firefly, part of what happens in Firefly is that two in particular of the main characters used to be soldiers and have become outcasts, and their purpose and their work has shifted. And so there's this upending of the ones who were engaging in warfare and fighting, and, like, admittedly, like, fighting for presumably the good guys who ended up losing. That focus on, like, militarism has shifted and flipped, and they become, Firefly in particular, the ship, becomes this sanctuary space for people who are trying to seek safety and trying to escape. And, like, they still engage in violence and all of those things, but there's a shifting and a flipping of their purpose, I think. That's how I read it, having not seen it in a long time.
Interesting that it's about scattering the arrogant and the proud. It's not like I took them down. I changed their hearts, or I punished them, or I had them do this, or I had them do that. No, it's scattering them. Don't let them congregate together. Don't let them be in large groups.
That is so true.
Like, scatter them out.
Pandemic restrictions on gathering in large groups.
You are way too arrogant. Quarantine for you. Quarantine.
We should just quarantine all of the arrogant. But that is true, because, like, there is this way in which
it magnifies the worst parts of when they gather. Yeah.
Instead of magnifying God.
Our epistle reading for this episode is from Romans chapter 16, verses 25 through 27. At the end of his letter to the followers of Christ in Rome, Paul praises God for sending Jesus Christ and sharing the gospel with everyone.
So one of the themes that I noticed in this passage is the theme of revelation or revealing. It's a short passage, but in the whole book of Romans, Paul is talking about what he's done and what they've done and the way that God has been revealed, and the good news has been revealed. And so, again, with the young adult dystopias, this time specifically with Divergent, there is a sense of revelation that happens within the Divergent series. At first, it's about the secret work that is happening, like, against abnegation, which is one of the factions, and then the secret work that Candor in particular, then they find out more about Candor, and then it's about the secret work that Candor is doing to try to, like, upend everything, and then it's about the outside people that are monitoring. And so at each level in the books, there's this scandal, there's this revelation of a power structure that isn't expected, there's this revelation of a new opportunity, right, when there's those outside the faction system that nobody really thought about or knew about, or those outside of the walls of where they live that nobody really knew about. And so it's sometimes the revelation is against the powerful and, like, an acknowledging of harm that's being done, and sometimes the revelation is just, like, this new thing that people are not aware of.
So, like, this reminds me of the current position of his Dark Materials. Are either of you watching his Dark Materials on HBO?
I don't have that kind of money, but I want to once it gets released to, like, Netflix or something.
And, like, right now we're at the part in it where Lyra, the girl, she's part of a prophecy. She's part of a written prophecy that the witches know, that the rest of her world doesn't know about. And the last episode that aired was fascinating. It, like, brought up all kinds of theological questions for me, because the witch's eagle comes to find the bear because he's like, hey, where's Lyra? There's this prophecy. And the bear says, he knows that the bear saw her last. And he says, does Lyra know there's a prophecy? And the bird is like, no, she can't know, or the prophecy can't be fulfilled if she knows it. It has to be kept a secret from her, or she can't fulfill her destiny. And the bear's like, and I can't remember the exact words the bear says, but something along the lines of like, so she's a pawn in your game and you want me to be okay with that. And it was just
Yay,
like,
York, Branson.
so there's like a lot of like theological questions in that. Why do prophecies have to be hidden in order for quote unquote the obedience of the faith, or for them to come forward, or for them to, and I don't know the answer, but there are questions about it, and we like geek out in church when over things like this. Like the response from like your everyday person is really similar to the bear.
Like how
why
constantly in superhero shows or movies they think that they have to keep the fact that they're a superhero from all their closest loved ones, because if they don't maintain the lie then something horrible will happen, but then they maintain the lie and then something horrible happens.
Like, it's a plot device that's overused now, get over it. But like it but though this question in theology, like, oh well, it was always hidden and the real meaning hasn't been divulged until now and it had to be kept a secret, and I'm like, us in the congregations are like,
Gnosticism. There's a reason why secret knowledge is a popular and well-loved thing, because people love thinking that they're in on something no one else is. It becomes incredibly popular, and you can do really horrible things with it.
So as we dive into this, verse 25, we hear, "Now to God who is able to strengthen you according to my gospel and the proclamation of Jesus Christ." And I was thinking about the ways that people are strengthened, and particularly, right, Paul is writing about his own proclamation, and so God strengthening people through words and through exhortation and presence. And Lord of the Rings, this is like the clearest example for me is in Lord of the Rings, where frequently the job of the like king or soon to be king or leader, depending on who we're talking about when going into a hopeless battle, is to strengthen the people, right, with what they say. So Aragorn does this at Helm's Deep of like, if this is to be our end, it will be such an end. Or Theoden, I think that was Aragorn, I might be misquoting, or Theoden talking before they descend on Gondor to help the battle at Gondor, or Aragorn again in front of the gates to Mordor saying like, for Frodo, and then all of the hobbits like take off running first, and
then everyone
like,
else is guilted into running
in like 5 seconds
because they don't want to be outshone by hobbits.
I mean, less guilted than inspired.
Sure,
I think,
that works too. Whatever works.
Yeah, maybe.
In verse 27, we hear Paul refer to the only wise God. I would like to take a moment to expand on this and point out that this means that God is only wise and never foolish, foolish being the opposite of wise. God can be silly if God wants to. God has a sense of humor. But God is only wise. Not that God is the only wise God among many gods. That is not where Paul is
How do you know?
I'm pretty sure the Greek grammar will back me up on that, but also Paul was not really into pantheism or...
except for that one time that he talked about, like, oh, you remember in your, like, temple, all of those gods, and the one that's to the unknown God, that's my God.
Yes, that's because he was talking to people who weren't monotheists. That doesn't mean he's not one. And speaking of the ancient Greeks, I would like to point out that while Xena, Warrior Princess, and Hercules, The Legendary Journeys were sometimes very fun TV shows and have created so many memes, the Greek pantheon, according to their shows, faded away when Christianity got popular. That is not how that works according to Christianity, and we're like reasonably certain according to history, like pretty certain. Not, we only have actual written proof for so much stuff, but also, time travel was a thing in those shows, and time really doesn't work that way, but that's a whole separate thing. So
as we move into our fourth and final reading for this week, we are at Luke chapter 1, verses 26 through 38. The angel Gabriel visits Mary, a young unmarried woman, to tell her that God has chosen her to be the mother of Jesus, the Son of God, whose kingdom will have no end. After getting clarification from the angel, Mary consents. So, one of the themes that is maybe super obvious based on the description is consent. Consent is important. Consent is necessary. Consent is really difficult and complicated when there's hierarchies because there's power dynamics that impede consent. And yet, as Suzannah so well articulated in our deep dive, right? Mary, like Buffy, takes this information. For Mary, it's from this potentially terrifying angel. And for Buffy, it's from the people in charge of the Slayers, the Watchers?
Yeah.
Who tells her that she's... Yeah, the Watchers. And is like, what? And then gets more information. And then is like, okay, but I'm going to do it my way. And that way becomes God's way. / is God's way. And so that's like, there is so much about Christmas and Advent and Mary. But there's so much in Mary's story and in the Christmas story that makes Mary into this helpless, mild, meek person. We just, right, December 1st, which was just a couple of days before we're recording this, was the anniversary of Rosa Parks not getting up off the bus. Not because she was a tired elderly woman who was tired from a day of work, but because she was a strategic person making a strategic decision for the good of the larger thing. And in this case, right, I wonder which number Mary was. Was Mary the first Mary? Because there's a bunch of Marys like running around in this time because...
It's a popular name.
Naming your kid Mary was like looking at the Roman Empire and being like, yeah, what now? There's a different way to say it, but it's not appropriate for our podcast. So, right. So there's like lots of Marys that the angel could have gone to who were like, nope, no thanks, no. And this Mary said, okay, wait, biology? And the angel said, meh. And then she said, all right, I'm in. There is agency in that, and there is such importance in believing her story about what happened to her. And when we lose that, we lose the meaning of Christmas.
Yes.
That is my claim.
I think there's a lot that can be said about pregnancy and choice on this. The part immediately before this is the part that is frequently... The part immediately before the Magnificat is the part that everybody does, quote, in order to advocate against abortion. And I find that disingenuous. I find it upsetting to me that we talk about these women as if they didn't consent to be pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
As if they are in the same boat as so many women who don't want to be pregnant. And I think it's important that we see that in this, God does not make someone pregnant without their permission.
Yeah.
God is not in pregnancy without their permission. Any person who is pregnant and it is not by consent, that is not something that God is down with.
Correct.
That is not something that God has preordained or was a part of. And I think it's important to note in this particular part of scripture that there was consent to be pregnant.
Yeah.
Mary enthusiastic, and so did Elizabeth. They both consented to be pregnant. And that's just important to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even when God is determining how God's own son will come into the world.
Yeah.
When God does huge miracles, God doesn't even do huge miracles without consent.
Yeah.
Yep.
In verse 29, we hear, but Mary was much perplexed by his words and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. Now, I think that's entirely reasonable on the part of Mary. Let's notice that the angel did not actually introduce himself yet. The angel has not explained who he is or why he's there yet. He just showed up and claims that God favors her.
And also biology.
She doesn't really know what's going on exactly, and there's lots of different types of greetings in the universe, and those various types of greetings can mean a lot of things. One of the things that this reminded me of was in an episode of Twilight Zone from a million years ago. In one episode, the humans have first contact with an alien race, and the aliens are kind of confusing to them because there's a language barrier. And so the aliens would like to bring some humans home with them to their home planet. And they ask the humans that, and somehow that meaning gets through. And the aliens then give them a book to explain, this is why we would like to bring you with us back to our home planet. And the book is in the aliens' language. So various humans are trying to translate it, but it takes a while. And most humans were greatly comforted once the title of the book was translated, because the title of the book was apparently To Serve Man. Man being humanity in this case, because this was in the 60s or something. Later on in the episode, after some humans have boarded the spaceship to go to the aliens' planet, spoiler alert, more of the book is translated, and that's when they discover the book is a cookbook. Ew.
I do not want to be served.
No, exactly.
Capacity.
But, so, just because someone is saying hi and nice to meet you, and we would like to, take you home with us, that doesn't mean it's a good idea. So I think Mary is perfectly reasonable to be wondering, so what kind of greeting is this? What's going on? What's this going to mean for me? Because you really don't know.
Which brings us to the next verse, where the angel says to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God." Which, okay, as Kay alluded to, angels, biblically, do not look like what we might see in any of the nativity sets that I own,
and the
at least.
nightgowns and the wings.
They're actually more like sci-fi monsters with lots and lots of eyes. There's actually this, great meme that I have, but it's there are a bunch of memes. If you Google biblical angels eyes, you'll find them, but we'll link to at least one. But the memes of God in the process of creating an angel and being well, we should make sure the angel is comforting to humans. So what do humans find comforting? Oh, well, when they're trying to comfort each other, they look in each other's eyes. So we'll put lots of eyes on the angel. And so that's how angels become these massive amounts of eyes, which of course prompt the "do not be afraid," because the immediate reaction to some creature with a bazillion eyes is
seriously, God already made spiders, right? Humans are afraid of spiders.
I know. We don't need anything else freaky. Yeah.
And I just would like to add on to that Mary may be woman, but Mary has also got to have the label of non-conforming.
Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
500%. Have y'all seen Arrival with Amy Adams, the alien movie?
I love the movie Arrival. I talked about that in one of our recent episodes a bunch.
When you're talking about the aliens and the mistranslate, and you're talking about aliens. I'm sorry, you're talking about angels, which I'm being reminded of the aliens at Arrival. And then Kay is talking about mistranslations in messages. And I could not stop thinking about Amy Adams in Arrival. Because, you have this, crazy-looking being that's clearly not human, comes down, gives a message, humans completely interpret that message very weird. The alien says, "Here, gift, use weapon," and everybody panics the whole world over. And it took the Amy Adams character to realize that the way that they were translating it was wrong, because it was they were translating it as weapon. It meant tool. And it was really actually this amazing gift of being able to see how the world works together, how all of the pieces fit together, this amazing overall huge God's plan. And in that way, the Amy Adams character is so much like the Mary character here, where she was able to see this, you have this fantastical creature who is not human comes down and gives her a message, and it takes a very special human to see the overall plan of that message and not completely panic.
Part of what I love about The Arrival is actually, I don't know if you've read the short story that it's based off of.
Story of Your Life?
It's just a short story. The Story of Your Life. Who's the author?
Ted Chiang?
Yes. I'm not positive on the pronunciation, but that is the short story. It's fantastic, and there is so much more, and I wish that you had read it before watching the movie, but I think it'll also be fascinating to you now. But
yeah, I had no idea it was based on a short story.
It's so good.
I believe you. I will absolutely read it now that I'm seeing her as a Mary figure. Definitely.
And I did want to point out that one of the things about this passage, about the season of Advent, and about human storytelling is that we have certain tendencies in our storytelling to like certain kinds of stories. So when we talk about miraculous births, those are wonderful stories. We like telling those stories. We don't like telling the other opposite. There are no women in the Bible who are known to be barren and who don't ever have a kid. All of the barren women in the Bible get to have a child. There are remarkably few stories of women who want to have a child and don't get to have one, out there in the world, because we like telling stories about people getting what they want. When we talk about the importance of seeing yourself reflected in stories, and particularly in the Bible and also in the church, When we talk about Advent, when we talk about pregnancy, when we talk about people who can get pregnant, I also want to encourage people to remember that there are going to be people in your congregation, there are going to be people who are listening to you talk about Advent or Mary or whatever, who wanted to have a child and didn't get to. And miraculous births aside, not everyone gets to. There are going to be people out there who don't get that particular style of happy ending. Now, that doesn't mean they don't get to have a happy life, but that is a struggle a number of people face, and usually it's more people than we know.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is always an important part. There are different Advents where it is more and less prominent for my own self, but always is a prominent fixture in any community of faith. It's going to be a prominent fixture.
Yeah, I feel you. I'm struggling with that too. I'm in my 40s now, and I did not have children, and I still struggle. I also think about Jesus later defining for Jesus' own self who is family and who is mother. Mm-hmm. And it's the solace it is the solace that I get. So like my flip side to what Pastor Kay is talking about is that also we don't talk enough about all the chosen families in the Bible that specifically are about choosing family, and that family being so holy, so important, so essential to the narrative arc of existence that it changes everything. I just want to also like uplift all the others that we're not elevating that are vitally important, and also help with this feeling of like, for me is internalized misogyny, that like my whole purpose in life was, like I'm like not doing what I was biologically supposed to do.
Yes.
Like that internalized misogyny is real. Like I'm just gonna name it. Like if you feel it, it's real and it's wrong.
If you don't want to have a kid, you don't have to. Mm-hmm. Please don't if you don't want to.
It's so hard. And I mostly was in a lesbian bubble most of my adult life, and I still got that in my head. But those stories about chosen family in the Bible, and particularly Jesus saying like, it's I choose my family, and they're what gives me comfort and really like break me out of that toxicity.
Yeah. Well, Suzannah, do you have any final thoughts on life, the universe, and everything that you'd like to share? Although that was like just a really good thought on life, the universe, and everything. But
I want you to know that this comes from a place of not having any other time to talk about gospel and how it is reflected in my everyday life. I get Sunday during a sermon, and that's it. That is the life of lay, because we have to go to way crazy extremes to find places and contexts where we can talk about how scripture is manifesting in our everyday lives, which is why what you're doing is ministry, is real ministry. And I'm being excited and going way above hours and like going into depth with you should be proof to you about why this is ministry, what you're doing, and how important it is. And I appreciate you. So I think that's the thing I most want to say, is that I appreciate you. I appreciate you both. And when Emily said, do you want to do this? And I said to them, I'm somebody that's going to talk a lot. I mean, like, really sure you want me because I talk a lot. But it comes with you're meeting a real need. We are excited to talk about how our faith interjects with the everyday, including our love of sci-fi and nerdery, because that's where imagination is. And that's where we see God sometimes. And we just don't get to do it that often. And so you asked me on, and here I am blabbing away, and that should be proof to you of how much it is ministry. And I kind of do you a service when I say, hey, this can be a pastor's side hustle, but I want you to know that I say that with the most love and understanding that I really do believe this is where the ministry is. Thank you for not keeping my God in a cedar house on Sundays.
And thank you for joining.
Yes.
We are thrilled to have had you.
I am so glad that you could come on, and this, I'm sure, will not be the last time we have you on our podcast.
Is this what you were looking for?
Yeah.
And thank you also to our listeners for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for Christmas Eve. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH. Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Spotify, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you appreciate what we do or want to get actual transcripts of the podcast episodes, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that. Though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said, Pax Vobiscum.